For decades before the American Civil War, the Southern states believed they understood warfare. They believed battles were decided by courage, by experienced officers, by tradition, and by the will of men standing shoulder to shoulder. The idea that war could be decided by factories, railroads, and raw industrial output felt distant, almost irrelevant. But when the war finally began in April of 1861, the Confederacy would learn a lesson that would permanently change how Americans understood conflict. Not through speeches or declarations, but through shock, fear, and the slow realization that they were facing an enemy unlike any they had imagined. When Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, enthusiasm swept across the South. Many believed the North would lack the stomach for a long war. Others believed one decisive victory would force the Union to negotiate. Southern soldiers marched with confidence, convinced they were defending their homeland against an inferior opponent. Yet even in the earliest months, whispers began to circulate among Confederate scouts and officers. Reports described something unsettling. The North was not merely raising an army, it was mobilizing an entire nation. As Union forces gathered, Confederate observers watched endless columns of blue uniforms move across roads and rail lines. Men, wagons, artillery, ammunition, food supplies, all moving with an efficiency that felt unnatural. Southern soldiers, accustomed to smaller formations, struggled to comprehend the scale. For the first time, many realized that the Union was fighting a different kind of war, one powered not just by bravery, but by industry. This realization deepened as battles unfolded. Union artillery seemed to fire endlessly. Ammunition never ran out. Fresh troops replaced the wounded with relentless consistency. Confederate soldiers began to notice something deeply troubling. Every loss the Union suffered was quickly replaced, while Southern units grew thinner, weaker, and more exhausted with each engagement. The North could absorb punishment in a way the South simply could not. The psychological impact of this imbalance cannot be overstated. Confederate soldiers did not simply fear Union bullets, they feared Union endurance. Each time they fought, the same enemy returned, stronger, better supplied, and increasingly confident. Letters home described the unsettling feeling that the Union Army was not slowing down, not learning through mistakes, but overwhelming through sheer persistence.
Nowhere was this fear more pronounced than along the rivers of the South. For generations, rivers had been natural defenses, barriers that shaped movement and protected territory. That belief collapsed when Union ironclads appeared. Confederate soldiers stood helpless as iron-plated ships moved through waterways once thought secure. Cannon fire bounced off metal hulls. Fortifications crumbled. Rivers became invasion routes, highways of destruction that carried Union power deep into Southern territory. The fall of New Orleans sent shockwaves through the Confederacy. Soldiers and civilians alike realized that geography no longer protected them. The Union could strike wherever it pleased. Every mile of river became a potential front line. Every town along the water lived in quiet dread of the moment Union ships might appear on the horizon. As the war progressed, nowhere did this dread become more intense than at Vicksburg. Confederate soldiers dug in, determined to hold the Mississippi River. They believed that if Vicksburg stood, the Confederacy could survive. What followed was a nightmare of isolation, starvation, and constant bombardment. Union artillery never rested. Supplies never arrived. Days blurred into weeks as hunger gnawed at bodies and morale alike. Inside the trenches, Confederate soldiers whispered among themselves. They spoke not of tactics, but of inevitability. The Union had surrounded them completely, cutting off all escape. They watched as shells rained down with mechanical precision. The message was unmistakable. The North was not in a hurry. It could wait. It could starve them out. When Vicksburg finally fell, many Confederate soldiers understood something profound. The war had fundamentally changed. Victory was no longer about holding ground. It was about who could endure longer, and the Union could endure indefinitely. That realization carried into Gettysburg, where Confederate soldiers marched north, hoping for a decisive blow. What they encountered instead was a wall of fire. Union artillery tore through formations. Rifle fire cut down entire units in moments. Soldiers pressed forward out of duty, not hope. When the charge failed, survivors spoke of a haunting silence that followed. Not triumph, not anger, just the crushing understanding that the Union could stop even the most determined assault. After Gettysburg, the emotional tone within the Confederacy shifted. Confidence gave way to grim resolve and eventually exhaustion. But the most terrifying phase of the war was still to come. It arrived not as a single battle, but as a strategy that redefined warfare itself. When Union General William Tecumseh Sherman began his march through Georgia, Confederate soldiers and civilians alike witnessed something entirely new. Railroads were destroyed, supplies were burned, infrastructure was dismantled methodically. This was not a campaign aimed at armies alone. It was aimed at the South's ability to continue fighting at all.
For Confederate soldiers, the effect was devastating. They realized that even if they won every remaining battle, the foundations of their war effort were being erased behind the lines. Sherman's march sent a clear message. The Union was not just defeating the Confederate Army, it was dismantling the Confederate way of war itself. By 1865, Southern soldiers were shadows of the men who had marched so confidently years earlier. Hunger, fatigue, and loss weighed heavily. When General Robert E. Lee finally surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, many Confederate soldiers felt relief mixed with disbelief. They had not simply been defeated, they had been overwhelmed by a nation that had learned how to fight a modern war. The American Civil War ended not just with a surrender, but with a transformation. The United States emerged as a nation capable of mobilizing industry, manpower, and strategy on an unprecedented scale. For those who stood on the losing side, the lesson was permanent. War would never again be fought the same way. The Civil War is often remembered as a clash of ideals and identities. But for the men who watched Union armies advance, who heard ironclads break through defenses, who endured endless bombardments and relentless supply lines, it was something far more personal. It was the moment they realized that the future of warfare had arrived, and it belonged to a united, industrial America.
The surrender at Appomattox ended the fighting, but it did not erase what Confederate soldiers had witnessed over 4 brutal years. For many of them, the war did not truly end on that April day. It followed them home, into ruined towns, burned fields, and silent railroads. Everywhere they looked, they saw evidence of a force they had underestimated, a force that had reshaped the meaning of war itself. In the months after the surrender, former Confederate soldiers spoke quietly among themselves. They did not speak only of defeat.
They spoke of scale, of factories that never stopped, of trains that arrived on time, no matter how many were destroyed, of Union regiments that seemed endless, replenished again and again, as if drawn from an invisible reserve. For men who had relied on local militias and limited resources, this was a revelation that bordered on disbelief. Many Confederate veterans admitted something they would never have said during the war. They had not lost because they lacked courage. They had lost because they were fighting the past against the future. The Union had mastered coordination on a national level. Telegraph lines transmitted orders faster than horses could carry messages. Railroads allowed entire armies to shift positions in days instead of weeks. War had become a system, and the Confederacy had never built one. Union soldiers themselves understood this transformation, even if they did not fully articulate it. They had watched as logistics determined victories more often than bayonets. They saw how supply lines mattered as much as front lines. The Civil War taught the United States that modern warfare was not about isolated heroism alone, but about sustained pressure applied everywhere at once. For Confederate officers, this realization came too late. Early victories had reinforced false confidence. They believed skill could compensate for numbers, that leadership could overcome shortages. But each passing year proved otherwise. Union losses were replaced. Confederate losses were permanent. By the final year of the war, some Southern units were composed of boys and old men, standing against seasoned Union regiments equipped with superior weapons and steady supplies. The psychological toll of this imbalance was immense. Confederate soldiers began to expect defeat before battles even began. They learned to recognize the sound of Union artillery as something unstoppable. They watched Union camps expand overnight while their own rations shrank. This slow erosion of hope was perhaps the Union's greatest weapon. Even Confederate civilians felt the shift. Towns that once supported the war effort became quiet and hollow. Women and children watched Union troops pass through with an efficiency that felt almost mechanical. There was no chaos, no disorder, just movement, discipline, and inevitability. The message was clear. Resistance could delay, but it could not prevent the outcome. Historians would later describe the Civil War as America's first modern war, but those who lived through it felt that truth in real time. Confederate soldiers experienced it as a constant reminder that the rules had changed. Courage was still necessary, but no longer sufficient. Tradition still mattered, but it could not stop railroads or factories. In the decades that followed, this lesson shaped American military thinking. The United States would never again fight a war without considering logistics, production, and national coordination. The Civil War became a blueprint, studied, analyzed, and remembered, not just for its moral and political consequences, but for how it transformed warfare itself. For Americans today, the Civil War is often viewed through monuments, textbooks, and anniversaries. But for the men who stood on the battlefield, watching Union forces advance with overwhelming power, it was an awakening. They witnessed the birth of a nation capable of projecting strength on an unprecedented scale. The Union did not merely preserve the United States, it revealed what the United States could become when fully mobilized. A country that could move armies like machines, supply them endlessly, and apply pressure until resistance collapsed. That reality would echo through every American conflict that followed.
In the end, the Civil War left a legacy written not just in victory or defeat, but in understanding. It showed that wars are not won by belief alone, but by preparation, coordination, and endurance. And for the Confederate soldiers who once believed the South could stand alone against the North, the war taught a hard and lasting truth. America had entered a new age, and there was no turning back.
Long after the cannons fell silent, former Confederate soldiers struggled to reconcile what they had experienced with what they had once believed. Many had gone to war convinced that local knowledge, defensive positions, and experienced officers would be enough. What they encountered instead was a kind of warfare that felt impersonal, vast, and impossible to escape. The Union had not simply fought battles, it had applied pressure everywhere at once until resistance collapsed under its own weight. In conversations years later, veterans often described the same haunting image: Union supply trains rolling endlessly along repaired rail lines, even as Confederate forces sabotaged them repeatedly. Every destroyed bridge seemed to reappear, every cut line was restored. To men fighting with dwindling resources, this felt almost supernatural. It was as if the Union possessed an infinite ability to repair itself faster than it could be damaged. Confederate soldiers also noticed how Union command adapted. Early mistakes did not define Northern strategy for long. Failures became lessons, quickly corrected. Generals who could not coordinate large forces were replaced. Systems improved. Communication tightened. Over time, Union operations became smoother, faster, and more devastating. What began as a collection of armies evolved into a unified machine. This adaptability deeply unsettled Confederate leadership. Southern generals were often brilliant tacticians, capable of winning individual battles, but they were increasingly forced to fight against time itself. Every engagement, even a victory, drained resources they could not replace. Meanwhile, Union forces grew stronger through experience and scale. The introduction of African American soldiers into the Union Army further amplified this pressure. Confederate soldiers were stunned to see formerly enslaved men wearing Union blue, armed, trained, and fighting with determination. This was not only a military shock, but a psychological one. It symbolized that the Union was drawing strength from every corner of society, while the Confederacy grew narrower and weaker. As the war dragged on, desertions increased in the South. Soldiers returned home to find farms destroyed, families displaced, and communities struggling to survive. The war was no longer a distant front. It had consumed everything. Union strategy ensured that nowhere felt safe from its reach.
Even Confederate officers who continued to fight understood the truth privately. Diaries from the final years of the war revealed a grim acceptance. They knew the Union could lose battles and still win the war. They knew the South could win battles and still lose everything. This imbalance shaped every decision, every march, every desperate stand. The end at Appomattox was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There was no dramatic final battle, no last charge, just exhausted men laying down arms, aware that they had reached the limit of human endurance. For many Confederate soldiers, surrender felt less like defeat and more like release. Union soldiers standing across from them sensed it too.
They did not see enemies filled with hatred, but men worn down by a force larger than any individual army. The war had tested not just strength, but sustainability, and sustainability had decided the outcome. In the years that followed, the United States carried these lessons forward. Military planners studied the Civil War as proof that modern conflict required coordination between government, industry, transportation, and manpower. The nation that emerged from the war was forever changed, more centralized, more powerful, and more capable of projecting force on a massive scale. For the Confederate veterans, memory softened the bitterness but not the lesson. They remembered the bravery of their comrades, but they also remembered the relentless advance of Union power. The sound of trains, the thunder of artillery, the sight of blue uniforms appearing again and again, no matter how many fell. The American Civil War became a warning written in blood and iron. It showed that wars are not decided solely by who fights harder, but by who can fight longer, rebuild faster, and mobilize deeper reserves. It revealed that the true battlefield extends far beyond the front lines, into factories, rail yards, and supply depots. Today, when Americans look back at the Civil War, they often focus on its moral and political consequences. But beneath those narratives lies another truth. The war marked the moment the United States discovered its own capacity for total mobilization, a capacity that would later shape conflicts across the world. For the men who stood on the losing side, that realization came too late. They had fought with conviction, skill, and sacrifice, but they had faced a future they could not stop. A future where industrial power, national unity, and strategic endurance would decide wars. And that future was born on American soil, between Americans, in a conflict that redefined what it meant to wage war. The Civil War did not just preserve the Union, it revealed the full weight of what the Union could become.